I was having problems with the front diffs of my Yeti crawler. They're extremely loose. I've got 1 million weight oil in these front diffs, and it's almost like there's no diff oil in them at all. It's easy as it moves. I mean, it's fairly stiff, but nowhere near like what I want. So I'm going to go ahead and lock the front diffs. I got this Axial diff locker. It's for the Yeti specifically, the Yeti and the Terra. This locker comes with the locker piece and a couple of cups that you install into this locker piece, and this screws on apparently to the spur inside the differential. So I'm going to go ahead and get this open, see what's in the bag, and get it assembled.
Team Baxter.
So inside the packet are the 2 output cups, the actual locker, and a couple of screws. You get 2 set pins to install the output cups and a couple of screws to screw onto the bevel gear. So the next obvious step is pulling the existing differential out of the Yeti. So this is going to take a little bit of work as I have to remove quite a few pieces. This large cover, probably a little bit of the shock tower, the shocks, the front bumper has to be moved. All the stuff has to be moved out of the way so that I can get to the differential case, which is located here under all of this stuff. So I'm going to start pulling things off. I haven't done this since I put it together when I built the kit, so it'll be the first time for me. It looks like I'm going to start with disassembling the shocks, taking that 1 screw out of the shock tower on each shock, and pulling this back cover off that covers up the screws for the actual diff box. So the first thing I've done is remove the shocks. I unscrewed the shocks from the shock tower, and I stuck a spare nylon nut on the end so that I don't lose all the components on that shock there. Did that to both sides, of course, and I removed the wheels so that I could rotate part of the bumper out of the way. This is connected to the diff case itself, and it needs to be detached. Trying to do this with as few screws as possible, removing as few screws as possible. Next, I'm going to go behind the shock tower and remove 4 screws that are holding the diff in to the top plate. I'm also going to detach these 2 links that are connected to the shock tower and put the screws back in those so that I don't lose any screws. Okay, so I got the upper links disconnected, which also in turn disconnected the drive shafts from the diff itself. Also, while I was unscrewing, I pulled out the 2 long screws that hold the front plate in. I also loosened the 2 screws that make up the hinge for the arm. What this allows is for the front end to pull out. Also, in turn, I had to remove the 4 short screws underneath that hold the diff in from below. You can see one there. So now the diff case is loose with all the screws I've taken out. I can pull this front end of this bumper right out and slide this diff case out. It's still going to hold the main drive shaft that runs through the vehicle, but I'm not going to disconnect that right now because if I do, it'll just be floating inside the chassis, and that's not something I want. So just slip that up and out. That was fairly easy to get out. Not too hard. I think I removed maybe 10 screws versus a lot more that I could have pulled out. So I'm going to get this chassis out of the way and start dealing with this diff case by itself. So here's the diff case with the main drive shaft still attached. I'm not going to disconnect this until I absolutely have to. See how far I can get through this without having to disconnect it. There's 6 screws holding this diff case together. You've got 1, 2, and then 4 at the top. The 4 at the top are holding the shock mount, the shock tower on, and then you have 2 that are actually holding the diff case together. So I'm going to power those out real quick, and then I should be able to pop the front off of this diff case and pull out the actual diff. to get plenty of napkins on hand because this one is a little messy. All the grease I put in there has distributed, so I'm gonna get a couple napkins, get this cleaned up, and get those 6 screws out. So I did not have to remove 6 screws. I only have to remove 2 screws. I tried to remove the 2 bottom screws first, and turns out the cover pops right off. So that's 4 less screws I have to take out. And here's my differential, and that should slide right out as well without having to remove the main drive shaft. So I set that aside along with the cover and the 2 screws that I had to take out. And now I get to deal with this greasy diff. This needs to be cleaned up, taken apart, and the main gear removed so that I can assemble it onto the new locked gear. So I've got this greasy mustard tiger cleaned up, and I'm gonna start disassembling it and moving the parts onto this new locked differential. When I disassemble it, the only thing I'll be using are a couple of the components like the bearings, and I'll be taking the main gear. This diff cup I'll be putting onto this old gear I have just for my sanity to kind of help keep the gears together and all. Just loose screw on there, kind of close it up. They gave me an extra set of screws with the lock differential, so I'll be attaching that with the new screws, and I'll use these screws to attach it to this gear. Got the diff half separated. This is what my million weight oil turned into, some green sludge. And here's the other half with the one gear that I need. The pin just slid right off. It wasn't attached very well. Slid right off of there, but I needed it off anyway, so just pull that output off. And I need that bearing. I don't really need that seal anymore, I don't think, and I don't need this gear, so I'll peel that gear off and start attaching it to this new lock differential. So here's all the parts that I needed from the old diff. That's just the main gear and 2 bearings. Of course, if you have your own bearings, you can just substitute new bearings, but I chose to disassemble this old differential and pull the bearings off. So you get 3 pieces, 2 cups, 2 output cups. One's longer than the other. So what happens is the 2 bearings that you pulled or you got, whichever, one goes over the back end of the gear like so, other goes over the little diff locker like so. There's 2 holes in this diff locker, and the kit comes with 2 pins, so you line up the holes here on the diff locker with the gear. The one with the longer shaft goes on one side, and the one with the short shaft goes on the other side to line up with the appropriate holes. You get 4 screws in there and the 2 pins to lock the output shafts in. Of course, all of those will be Loctited. The manual comes with no instructions, but it's very simple to see what's going on, and that will all be locked together once it's built. So I'm going to go ahead and put the 4 screws in there and line up my holes and put the 2 pins in there. That leaves the output shafts at a 90-degree angle to each other, but it doesn't really matter. And that's as simple as the build process is. So I'm going to go ahead and get this built off camera, and then I'll be right back. Got the lock differential built, pretty sturdy it seems like. Pins through both sides, one there and one there, and 4 screws holding the whole assembly together. Those have been Loctited, and I'm going to let this sit for a little bit, just to kind of let the Loctite cure up just a little bit before I coat it in grease, and then I'll begin inserting it back into the diff box and getting the whole thing reassembled in reverse from what I just did. So now I re-greased the gear. So now I pop the rebuilt diff back down into the diff box, making sure it sits down nicely onto the brackets where it's supposed to. Slide the cover back on, and 2 screws go right back in there where they came from. So now I'm going to take this differential assembly and slide it back in here underneath of this top plate. I need to slide it back in and make sure that I put the drive shaft back into the transfer case output shaft. So slip that down in there and get it close, and then spin the rear wheel a little bit and try to get it where I need to. So I'm pushing this in the front, trying to push it into position. So it looks like I got it real close. I'm going to go ahead and push it down in there, and you can see the pin sitting in there just where I need it to be, and it is indeed rotating when I turn the rear wheels. So the first thing I'm doing now that I have the diff box back in place is putting these hinge screws back in place. That will give me a lot more stability and help me out a lot with the rest of this reassembly. Directly after these hinge screws, I'm going to go ahead and put back the long screws that help hold this diff box in. There's 2 of them. There's one, and one goes on the opposite side. Now that the front gearbox has been reassembled, I can put the 4 screws that secure it in the bottom. You can see 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now I reassemble the top links and put the front shaft back in. Top link just gets screwed back, and the front shaft also just pops into the output that I just installed. I'm going to pop a little grease in there because I've shown a little bit of signs of rusting on this drive shaft. The front links have been reattached, and now I reassemble the front bumper mount and the front shocks as well. 1 screw for the front bumper mount and 1 screw each for the top shock mount. Lastly, I put the 4 screws that hold the top plate onto the diff box, and that'll be the end of the front end reassembly. All that's left to do is put the wheels on and drive it.